October 3rd, 1944, Ellis County, Kansas. The storm had torn the farmer's barn down by dawn, but what shocked the German POWs most was what came next. The morning after the storm carried a strange kind of silence, the kind that settles over a place only after nature has made its point. The sky was still heavy with leftover clouds, stretched in long gray ribbons across the Kansas plains, and the air smelled of wet earth and splintered wood. The old barn on John Miller's property, standing for nearly 3 decades, lay broken across the pasture like a carcass picked clean. Roof beams snapped in half, boards twisted under the weight of fallen branches, straw blown everywhere. It was destruction, but not the kind men had seen in Europe. This was nature's war, not humanity's. By mid-morning, a military truck rumbled down the dirt road leading to the farm. Dust kicked up under its tires, mixing with the damp scent of the storm as it came to a halt near the wreckage. In its back sat 8 German prisoners, their denim uniforms still smelling faintly of the disinfectant powder used at Camp Concordia. They climbed down slowly, stiff from the ride, eyes narrowed against the bright Kansas daylight. One of them, Hans Becker, 27, a former machinist from Württemberg, stared at the collapsed barn with a hollow recognition. Buildings destroyed by wind looked eerily similar to buildings destroyed by bombs. Except here, there were no flames, no sirens, no screaming civilians. Just open sky stretching in every direction, a horizon so wide it made him dizzy. Hans had been told that American farmers used POW labor ruthlessly. Hard labor, long hours, little food, constant surveillance. Men whispered these stories on the ship across the Atlantic, and again on the train westward. The Americans won't waste a bullet on us. They'll work us to death instead. So, as the prisoners fanned out near the fallen barn, they braced for orders delivered like barked commands, for rifles pointed as reminders of their place. But nothing happened. The truck's engine fell quiet. The wind tugged at the loose edges of the barn roof. A dog somewhere in the distance barked once, twice, then stopped, and then the front door of the farmhouse creaked open. John Miller stepped outside, wearing suspenders over a faded work shirt, the kind of man who looked older than his 53 years, not from frailty but from seasons spent wrestling with land and weather. His hair was gray, but his posture still carried the stubborn strength of a man shaped by the depression, by drought, and by the expectation that work solved nearly everything. He didn't approach the prisoners with caution. He didn't rest a shotgun over his shoulder. He didn't even tighten his face with suspicion the way people do when confronted with the unfamiliar. He simply walked toward them as if greeting neighbors after a storm. Hans felt confusion ripple through the group. The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. This was not how German guards ever approached enemy laborers. In Germany, farmers and villagers greeted foreign workers with fear or contempt. Here, the man was wiping his hands on a rag as though he'd just stepped away from morning chores. When he reached them, he looked at the wreckage, let out a tired sigh, and said something so ordinary it disarmed every man standing there. "Boys, I just need a hand." No accusation, no anger, no hint of resentment for the uniform they once wore. He pointed his thumb toward the ruins of the barn. "My sons fighting in France," he continued, voice steady but softened by something deeper, something weary. "I'd be out there helping him if I could, but right now, this is the battle I've got. Let's fix this together." For a moment, no one moved. Even the guards from the camp, 2 young Americans from Georgia and Nebraska, looked as surprised as the Germans. They held their rifles casually, barrels pointed toward the dirt, almost as an afterthought rather than a threat. Hans blinked. "Fix this together?" The phrase felt foreign. Not the words themselves, he understood enough English, but the sentiment behind them. Germans didn't work with their prisoners. Germans commanded. Americans apparently asked for help. One POW cleared his throat, unsure whether to pick up a hammer or salute. Another looked at the guards, waiting for some sort of clarification. But John Miller was already walking toward the debris, stepping over broken planks, lifting a beam with a grunt. He paused only once and called back over his shoulder. "Well, don't let a man my age outwork you." Something in his tone, half challenge, half humor, cut through every expectation the POWs arrived with. Hans's hands moved before his brain caught up. He grabbed one end of the beam and helped lift. 2 more Germans joined him, then the rest, until 8 prisoners and 1 Kansas farmer were standing shoulder to shoulder, clearing the remnants of the storm. It was the first shock of the day, but not the last. As they worked, Hans tried to make sense of the situation. Kansas in 1944 was a land stretched thin by war. 12 million American men were overseas, leaving farms desperate for labor. The government sent POWs to fill the gap, but no rule book could explain the peculiar mix of trust and practicality unfolding on this farm. The guards didn't shout instructions. They stood back, watching without tension, chatting occasionally like men supervising a volunteer crew rather than controlling captives. And John Miller. He behaved as if the prisoners were simply hired hands who'd shown up late to help rebuild. Once, while lifting another beam, Hans heard him mutter, "Storms don't care who you fight for," as if it were the most natural truth in the world. By noon, the barn had begun to take shape again. The skeleton of its frame stood upright, held together by hastily nailed joints and the collective strength of 9 men who, hours earlier, would never have imagined working side by side. While tightening a bolt, Hans felt an odd warmth spreading through his chest, something like confusion, something like relief. He realized that not once since arriving had he felt threatened. Not once had he been yelled at. Not once had he been treated like an animal. If anything, he felt useful. And that, more than anything else, unsettled him. When they finally paused for breath, John Miller took off his hat, wiped his forehead, and studied the group with a kind of quiet gratitude that none of the prisoners were prepared for. No farmer in Germany would have looked at enemy captives like that. No farmer in Germany had been given the chance. Hans glanced at the barn, at Miller, at the guards chatting casually under the sun. A strange, heavy thought settled into him, one he didn't yet have the courage to accept. Everything he'd been taught about America might be wrong, and this was only the beginning of the shock. Hans had not always lifted American lumber beside American farmers. 3 months earlier, he had stood in a different kind of line, under a different sky, listening to a different kind of voice. Back in Germany, the lecture halls had smelled of chalk dust and sweat. Officers paced at the front, boots clicking on polished floors as a projector hummed behind them. The film on the screen showed caricatures more than enemies. Americans drawn with soft faces, slouched shoulders, cigarettes hanging from their lips. The narrator's voice was sharp, clipped, authoritative. "America is a mongrel nation," the instructor translated, his eyes sweeping the young men in gray uniforms. "A people of weak blood, Jews, Negroes, degenerates. They rely on machines, because their men are soft." The room murmured with low, dutiful contempt. Hans had sat in the second row, hands folded behind his back, jaw tight. He watched grainy images flicker by. New York streets crowded with cars, factories with high smokestacks, men in overalls laughing as they walked out of gigantic plants at shift's end. The narrator called it decadence, said it like an accusation. But even then, something about the scale unsettled him. Another reel started. This one showed American prisoners, actors he assumed, being dragged through mud, begging, breaking under interrogation. The instructor paused the film and faced the room. If captured by Americans, you must expect no mercy. They will starve you, humiliate you, experiment on you. Better to die in battle than fall into their hands. The men nodded. Hans nodded with them. It was the only safe thing to do. He carried those warnings with him through North Africa and Italy, through retreat and defeat, until the day an American patrol unit cornered his battery in a half-blasted orchard near Anzio. When he finally raised his hands, palms out, he assumed he had just traded bullets for a slower kind of death. Instead, the first American he saw offered him water. The fear did not leave. It simply changed shape. Weeks later, herded with hundreds of other prisoners onto a gray ship in an Italian port, Hans stood at the railing as the coastline receded into mist. The hold below decks stink of bodies and seawater, and rumors swirled like flies around a carcass. "They're taking us to a camp in the desert," one man said. "No, to factories. Slave labor. We'll never see home again. I heard they send some to Siberia, trade us to the Russians." Whenever someone mentioned the United States, the old warnings resurfaced. Americans as savages. Americans as executioners. Americans as faceless cogs in a machine that would grind them down. The first real shock came at mealtime. Prisoners were given basic rations, stew ladled into tin bowls, bread that was stale but edible, sometimes fruit. It wasn't generous, but it wasn't starvation. The Americans ate separately. Still, Hans could see them through an open doorway that led to the mess area reserved for the crew. He watched one sailor unwrap a sandwich piled thick with cold meat, take a few bites, then toss the crust, and half the filling, into a garbage bin without a second thought. Another opened a glass bottle of something dark. "Coca-Cola," someone whispered reverently, and after a few swallows left it half-finished on the table when a card game called him away. After the meal, a young prisoner named Otto elbowed Hans and nodded toward the trash. "Look at what they throw away," Otto muttered. "That's enough to feed a village back home." Hans said nothing, but he watched and he counted. Bread that had only been nibbled, meat with more pink than gray, apples with a single bite taken out, bruised more by disinterest than mishandling. A sailor cracked open a chocolate bar, frowned at a melted edge, and dropped it straight into the bin. Fear twisted itself into something more complicated: humiliation. If this was how Americans treated food, what did that say about their resources, their confidence, their belief that there would always be more? In the cramped bunks at night, men whispered in the dark. "The propaganda was wrong," someone said. "No, it was right. This is just a trick. Maybe they feed us now to make us weak later." Hans lay on his back, staring into the blackness, feeling the ship's engines thrum through the metal frame below him. He thought of his mother standing in line for hours in Stuttgart, holding ration coupons that bought less each month. He thought of his younger brother writing from the Eastern Front about thin soup and thinner bodies. Here, the enemy threw away calories his family would have treasured. The ship crossed the Atlantic in 11 days. The ocean rolled under them in gray-green waves, unforgiving and endless. One morning, Hans climbed to the deck and found a sailor reading a newspaper. The man noticed his glance and, on impulse, held the front page up so Hans could see the headline: The words meant nothing. Hans's English was poor, but the images screamed loudly enough. American assembly lines with rows of bombers under construction. Tanks lined up like metal beasts in a parade. Stacks of crates labeled with numbers so large they barely seemed real. Later, in the hold, an older prisoner who spoke better English explained what he'd overheard from a guard. "They built 96,000 aircraft last year," he said quietly. 29,000 tanks in 1 year. "So many," Otto scoffed. "That cannot be true." But Hans believed it. The newspaper photos had matched the scale he'd glimpsed in propaganda films. Only there it had been framed as decadence. On the ship, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like inevitability. When they finally reached the American coastline, dawn was just breaking. The gray outline of land grew sharper as the ship approached. Hans could make out cranes, warehouses, rows of buildings, and beyond them, a city that appeared untouched by war. No gaps where bombs had carved their signatures. No skeletal houses, no cratered streets. Smoke rose from factory chimneys, not from fires. The harbor bustled with activity. Cargo ships unloaded crates and vehicles. Trains waited on parallel tracks, ready to carry whatever came off those ships to wherever it was needed. Dock workers moved with practiced rhythm, some of them women with rolled-up sleeves and bandanas tied over their hair. They laughed between tasks, their faces open and unafraid. Hans watched them in a kind of stunned silence. This was not what Berlin looked like, not what Hamburg looked like, not what any German city looked like anymore. The fear that had started as dread of American cruelty shifted again, becoming something colder and sharper, the fear of having fought against something far larger and more organized than he'd ever imagined. On the train ride inland, bound for Kansas, the rumors started up again, but their tone had changed. "Have you heard? They're sending us to camps with hot water. They say there are libraries." "Libraries? For prisoners?" "Geneva Convention," the older man said. "The Americans actually follow it." Hans had heard of the Geneva rules in training, usually as a joke. Paper promises in a world of steel. Germany had signed them. So had America. But in practice, on the Eastern Front, in occupied territories, such niceties fell away. The idea that America might actually honor such agreements for enemy soldiers felt unreal. The train rolled through towns that looked like postcards. White church steeples, brick storefronts, gas stations with shining pumps. Children played in yards. Women hung laundry. Men loaded crates into trucks. The only visible sign of war was the occasional banner urging the purchase of war bonds, or a star hung in a window for a son overseas. No rubble, no refugees. No rubble turned into makeshift homes. As Kansas opened up around them, flat and vast and endlessly golden, Hans pressed his forehead to the window glass. The fields seemed to stretch until they merged with the horizon. Grain waves replaced smoke plumes. Barns, whole and painted, dotted the landscape like punctuation marks in an endless sentence about abundance. It was in this land that the Americans had built the camps. Camp Concordia, where Hans was first processed, looked less like a prison and more like a small, orderly town. There were guard towers and barbed wire, yes, but also neat rows of barracks, a mess hall, a chapel, even a building designated as a library. Inside, shelves held books in both English and German, donated by churches and universities and families who had never met the men who would read them. At the infirmary, a medic examined Hans's teeth, checked his lungs, noted a slight underweight condition, and recommended more milk, for a man whose nation had tried to destroy his. In the mess hall, the first night's dinner included meat, potatoes, bread, and glasses of cold white milk that clinked faintly when set on the tables. Some prisoners refused to eat, convinced it was poisoned. Others hesitated, then gave in to hunger. Within days, suspicion and appetite wrestled openly in every barrack. "Why feed us like this?" Otto demanded one night, staring at his plate. "If they hate us, why waste food on us?" No one had an answer. The official explanation came in pieces. Snatches of conversation overheard from guards, half-understood newspaper articles, lectures from American officers who addressed the prisoners through interpreters. America, they said, was bound by law and principle. Prisoners of war would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Adequate food, shelter, medical care, not out of softness but out of strength, out of a belief that how a nation treated its enemies said something fundamental about who it was. The numbers Hans had seen in that newspaper, aircraft, tanks, ships, were one kind of power. The full shelves in the camp kitchen, the milk in his glass, the books on the library table were another. Yet fear did not vanish. It lingered under the surface, fed now not by the threat of torture, but by the unsettling realization that everything he had been told about the enemy might be collapsing. On the day they drove him out to the Miller farm, that fear rode with him in the truck bed, crouched between his ribs. Fear that this kindness was a trick. Fear that the bottom would eventually drop out and reveal the cruelty promised by all those lectures and films. Fear, most of all, that if America was truly like this, fed, confident, lawful, then the war had never been winnable, and he had given years of his life to a lie. Standing in front of a shattered Kansas barn, watching an American farmer ask for help instead of offering threats, Hans felt that fear swell and crack in the same moment. The enemy he had trained to hate was not behaving like an enemy, and that, for a soldier raised on propaganda, was terrifying in a way no bullet had ever been. The morning wind sharpened as the sun climbed, cutting across the open field with a chill that seeped through denim and bone. Kansas winds were strange that way. Cold even under a bright sky, fierce enough to make a man brace his shoulders as though expecting a blow. The POWs worked in steady rhythm, clearing splintered timbers, resetting the foundation stones, hauling anything still usable toward a growing pile that Hans silently labeled salvage. They worked because they had been told to. They worked because there was nothing else to do. But mostly they worked because the farmer worked beside them. Around mid-morning, John Miller disappeared into the farmhouse. The prisoners exchanged quick glances, some tense, some suspicious, all shaped by memories of German sergeants who vanished only to return with punishment in hand. Hans swallowed the metallic taste of anxiety and kept his grip on the beam he was lifting. In war, men learned that quiet moments often signaled danger. A minute later, Miller emerged again. Not with a weapon, not with a warning, but with a bucket. Condensation slid down its sides. Inside were glass bottles, cold, sweating, glinting in the sun. "Water," Miller called. "Come on now, don't be shy." He walked straight up to the nearest prisoner, a thin boy from Hamburg whose name Hans didn't know, and pressed a bottle into his hands as though offering it to his own nephew. The boy stared at it like a trick. Miller nodded toward the cap. "Go on," he urged. "You boys look cold. Kansas winds don't care what uniform you wear." The boy opened the bottle with trembling fingers. He took a sip, then another, and then a breath so deep it lifted his narrow chest. Hans watched, stunned. The farmer moved down the line, handing bottles one by one. When he reached Hans, he offered another with that same matter-of-fact friendliness, as if politeness were a force of habit he could not abandon. Hans hesitated, then accepted it with both hands. The glass was so cold it stung his palms. He hadn't held cold anything in months. He took a cautious sip, tasting minerals, well water, and something else. Cleanliness, normalcy, a simplicity that suddenly felt impossibly out of reach. Miller saw the hesitation in his eyes. "Long trip here, wasn't it?" he asked. Hans nodded. His English was halting, but he managed. "Yes, many weeks." "Thought so," Miller replied. "Well, take your time with that water. Weather's not forgiving today." He said it without irony, without even the faintest trace of condescension. Just an older man acknowledging a younger man's exhaustion. The guards didn't react, except to take bottles themselves. One of them, Corporal Davis, raised his drink slightly in a gesture that looked far too casual for a war setting. Hans found himself returning the nod before he could stop the instinct. Later, when the men were pulling out shattered boards from the barn's collapsed side wall, one of the POWs began to falter. He had worked too hard, too fast, and his breath came in ragged pulls. Hans turned just in time to see his knees buckle. Before any prisoner could react, Miller was already there. "Easy there," he said, catching the man under the arm. "Sit a spell. Rest comes before pride, son." Rest? Rest? In German camps, rest was a luxury granted only when exhaustion made a man useless. Here it was given as though it were simply part of the workday. The man looked to the guards, expecting punishment. None came. Davis gave a shrug, as if the idea of berating a man for fatigue were absurd. "Let him breathe," Davis said. "Ain't a race." The prisoners returned to their tasks with stunned silence. The moment had cracked something, small but undeniable, inside the rigid shell of what they thought America would be. By noon, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of damp hay and the faint sweetness of cut wheat from neighboring fields. Miller called for a break, his voice edged with the natural authority of a man who had managed farms longer than most soldiers had been alive. "Settle down a minute," he said. "You all need your strength. Kansas doesn't give second chances." They gathered near the fence line, some sitting, some standing stiffly, unsure if relaxing was allowed. Hans stood with his back straight, unwilling to risk appearing disrespectful. Old habits from the German army were hard to kill. Miller eased himself onto an overturned crate and looked at them with curiosity that felt harmless. Genuine, even. "So," he began, "where's everyone from?" Silence, the kind seasoned by fear. He tried again. "No need for details. Just curious how far y'all traveled before this war found you." This time, a man at the end of the line spoke. "Dresden," he said quietly. Miller nodded. "Heard it's a beautiful city." Another whispered, "Munich." "Bet the beer's good," Miller replied. A third murmured, "Bremen." "Close to the water, then. My wife always wanted to see the ocean." The conversation was impossible, not because of language, but because of its simplicity. No interrogation, no suspicion, just a farmer making small talk with men who might, in a different lifetime, have been the type to help mend fences or harvest wheat. Finally, Miller's eyes settled on Hans. "And you?" he asked. Hans swallowed. "I come from Stuttgart." Miller grinned lightly. "Car country, huh? Well, if this barn had wheels, I'd put you in charge." The prisoners chuckled, an awkward, uncertain, but unmistakable sound. Hans felt the corner of his mouth twitch, the first hint of a smile he hadn't worn since before Tunisia. As the break ended, Miller tossed something toward Hans. A hammer, The handle was smooth from years of use and the weight settled naturally into his grip. Hans froze, uncertain whether it was a test. "You know how to use that?" Miller asked. Hans nodded. "Yes, machinist. Before war." "Well then," the farmer said, "how about you drive the nails on the north wall? Need someone who knows what he's doing. I trust you." That last sentence hit harder than the hammer's weight. "I trust you." Hans had been trusted with many things in his life: machines, measurements, a rifle, but never with trust itself. Not from an American, and certainly not when standing behind a fence, wearing a prisoner's denim shirt. He approached the half-rebuilt wall. The timber frame was roughly aligned, held by temporary braces. Miller's instructions had been brief, assuming competence rather than ignorance. Hans positioned the first nail, exhaled, and drove it cleanly with 3 decisive strikes. He expected a guard to shout, expected Miller to snatch the hammer away, expected something, anything, to remind him of his place. Nothing happened. Instead, Miller adjusted another board nearby and said, "Good, that's clean work there. Keep going." The sentence was ordinary, but to Hans it felt like a revelation. Kindness, real kindness, was rarely dramatic. It was small things done without performance. A bottle of water, a chance to rest, a question about home. A hammer handed over without hesitation. It slipped past defenses like light under a door. As the afternoon sun warmed the wreckage, the prisoners began to work not with the forced obedience of captives, but with the quiet resolve of men who wanted to earn the respect they were being shown. Every nail driven felt less like labor and more like participation. Every board lifted felt less like obligation and more like contribution. Hans found himself stepping in to help another prisoner align a beam. Another time, he caught Miller's glance across the frame, and they exchanged a nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that transcended uniforms. The fear in Hans's chest, the one that had traveled with him from Germany to Italy to the Atlantic and into Kansas, began to thin around the edges. Not vanish, not yet, but loosen. By late afternoon, the skeleton of the barn stood taller than it had that morning, still imperfect, still raw, but undeniably alive again. The men stepped back to survey their work. Miller folded his arms and smiled, the kind of smile worn by a man who has seen storms tear through his life more times than he can count and still chooses to rebuild. "You boys did good," he said. "Boys, not prisoners, not Germans, just boys." The weight of that small mercy sank deep. Hans let his gaze drift across the golden fields stretching beyond the property. The land was open, unscarred, calm in a way Europe hadn't been in years. He tried to imagine what it would be like to live in a place where barns fell because of storms, not because of bombs, where farmers held out water instead of suspicion, where work was honest, not weaponized. This wasn't the America he had been taught to hate. This wasn't the enemy he had been trained to fear. Somewhere inside him, an old rigid belief cracked quietly, and, though he didn't yet know it, the crack would widen before the day was done, wide enough to let in a warmth that frightened him far more than the cold Kansas wind ever could. By late afternoon, the light over the Kansas prairie softened into a warm, honey-colored glow. The hardest part of the workday was behind them. The barn's new frame stood upright, held together by determination, sweat, and an unlikely communion of hands that months earlier had belonged to enemies. The wind quieted, as if exhausted from watching the effort. The prisoners gathered near the fence line, their breaths rising in tired clouds. Their shirts clung to their backs. Dust coated their hair. 6 hours had passed since they first stepped onto John Miller's land, and although no one said it aloud, the strangest truth had settled into all of them. They had been treated like men. No shouting, no blows, no insults, just work. Real work. The honest kind, the kind they'd known before the war consumed their lives and identities. Hans Becker leaned against a post, rubbing the ache from his shoulder. He felt a fatigue that was strangely pleasant, the kind that reminded him of days in his father's workshop, when the smell of oil and metal had clung to his clothes. For the first time since his capture, exhaustion did not feel like a punishment. He was lost in that thought when the farmhouse door opened again. At first, he assumed Miller was coming to inspect the barn or dismiss them back to the truck. But the farmer was holding something that made every prisoner straighten in bewilderment. A pie. Round, steaming, wrapped carefully in a thick cloth to shield his hands from the heat. Apple pie. The smell reached them before Miller did. Warm cinnamon, sugar, butter, baked apples softened into sweetness. A scent that belonged in a kitchen, in a family home, not in an open field shared by armed guards and enemy soldiers. The POWs watched him approach with expressions that bordered on alarm. In their world, food had been a reward, a bribe, a punishment, or a means of control. Nothing about the moment made sense. Miller stopped a few feet away and studied their faces. He smiled. A modest, sincere smile as worn and gentle as the lines on his hands. "Figured you boys could use something warm," he said. "Storm left me with a mess, but it didn't touch the oven." Nobody moved. The guards shifted uncertainly, as if unsure whether this scene broke some rule of wartime conduct. One of them opened his mouth, but Miller raised a hand, dismissing whatever concern he meant to voice. "This," he said, lifting the pie slightly, "is how my wife thanked neighbors when they helped her. Work is work. Men should eat." Still, no one moved. Hans felt an old instinct coil tight inside him. When something looked too generous, too gentle, too human, it was usually bait. He had seen entire villages in Germany manipulated by the promise of bread. He had watched soldiers in France fall for kindness that hid daggers. A pie? For them? For enemy prisoners? One of the POWs whispered, "Is this a test?" Another murmured, "Poison." A third shook his head. "He's mocking us. He must be." Hans said nothing, but his pulse quickened. Every warning he had ever heard about American deception returned in sharp fragments. He felt dizzy, the smell of apples twisting inside him in a way that was half hunger, half terror. Miller noticed. He stepped closer and placed the pie gently on a plank of wood, as though offering it to the earth itself rather than to the men before him. "No tricks," he said quietly. "You helped me. This is thanks." The simplicity of the words struck harder than any blow could have. Hans stared at the pie, then at the farmer. His mind drifted against his will. Back to Germany, back to Stuttgart, to a kitchen much smaller than this Kansas farm, where a woman with soft hands would hum as she leaned over a tin pan of apples. His mother never wasted fruit. Apples, bruised from market stalls, were turned into pies that perfumed the entire house. She made them on Sundays when there was enough flour. She made them on holidays when there was none. Hans and his brother would sit at the table waiting for the crust to turn golden, the sugar to bubble along the edges. The memory hit him with a force that stole his breath. He heard her voice as if she were standing beside him. Geduld, Hans. Patience. Good things take time. He had not thought about her voice in months. Not like this, not with warmth. He blinked rapidly. The field swam. Miller's attention shifted toward him. "You all right there, son?" Hans tried to answer, but the words tangled in his throat. Something monstrous and fragile pushed upward from inside him. Grief, exhaustion, hunger, longing, the catastrophic convergence of everything he'd lost and everything he'd been denied, now awakened by the smell of something as simple and innocent as pie. He dropped to his knees. It happened without warning. One moment he was standing, the next he was folded onto the ground, hands braced in the dry Kansas dirt. The guards startled. The other POWs froze. Even Miller stepped back in surprise. Hans tried to catch his breath. His chest clenched. Tears blurred his vision. He pressed a hand against his face, but it did nothing to stop the flood. He was not crying because he was hungry. He was crying because he remembered being loved. The sound that left him wasn't a sob. It was something older, something deeper. A sound formed in the ruins of Stuttgart, in the nights spent beneath sirens, in the hollow ache of hunger when bread lines vanished in smoke. A sound shaped by the loss of his family, the destruction of his country, the weight of propaganda, the humiliation of defeat, and the shocking realization that even after all of that, someone had handed him kindness without cost. The other prisoners stared, terrified of the vulnerability unfolding before them. They had survived war by hiding weakness. But here, weakness came like rain after drought, unavoidable, overwhelming. Miller moved closer, kneeling beside Hans. He didn't touch him. He didn't rush him. He simply waited. After a long moment, Hans managed to whisper, broken, raw, barely audible. "Why?" he asked. "Why treat us like this?" Miller exhaled slowly. His voice, when it came, was tender in a way that carried the weight of a father speaking to a wounded son. "Because you helped me," he said, "and because it's the right thing to do." Hans shook his head. He wasn't asking about the pie. He was asking about something much larger, about the day, about the tone, about the water, about the trust so casually given, about the humanity he'd been told Americans didn't possess. Miller seemed to understand. "War don't make us forget who we are," he said softly, "least not if we don't let it." The Kansas wind stirred gently, brushing the farmer's sleeves, lifting strands of Hans's hair. Behind them, the half-built barn cast long shadows across the ground, shadows of pillars rising again after ruin. For the first time in years, Hans let his tears fall without shame. Around him, the other prisoners looked away, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. They stood in silence as though witnessing something sacred. The pie sat between them, steam curling into the air like the last breath of a memory resurrected. In Germany, Hans had watched everything collapse: cities, armies, nations, ideals. Here, on a strange farm in the middle of America, something inside him was being rebuilt, not with wood, not with nails, but with kindness so gentle it dismantled every wall he had ever built to survive the war. When he finally lifted his head, eyes red, cheeks streaked with dust and grief, Miller offered him the first slice. "Eat, son," he said. "You've earned it." Hans accepted it with trembling hands. The crust was warm, the apples soft. The taste flooded him with memories of a life lost to bombs and sirens and fear. He closed his eyes, letting the sweetness settle into the cracks where despair had lived. At that moment, something irreversible happened. Not in the barn, not on the farm, but deep in the core of a man who had arrived expecting hatred and found mercy instead. For the rest of his life, he would remember the smell of that pie. For the rest of his life, he would remember the words that accompanied it. Work is work. Men should eat, and goodness, true goodness, needs no translation. The pie had been cut, shared, eaten in a silence too deep for words. Even when the guards finally signaled it was time to load the German prisoners back onto the truck, No one moved immediately. Something had shifted. Subtle, invisible, but undeniable. As if the moral gravity of the day had tilted a few degrees toward a truth no one could yet speak aloud. Hans Becker sat in the truck bed, hands folded around the last crumbs of crust he had saved, though he did not know why. The sun had lowered into a mellow gold, casting long shadows across the Kansas plains. As the vehicle rumbled away from the Miller farm, Hans kept his eyes fixed on the shrinking silhouette of the rebuilt barn, its beams catching the light like the ribs of a living creature stitched back together. It wasn't the barn he was looking at, it was what it represented, or rather, what it contradicted. A few minutes into the drive, the truck slowed briefly at the farmhouse gate. Through the open window, Hans caught a glimpse of something that pierced him more deeply than the pie had. John Miller's wife stood on the porch, holding a tray with 2 glasses of sweet tea. Beside her, their granddaughter toddled across the wooden planks, laughing at something only children or angels could see. Miller walked up the steps, planted a kiss on his wife's cheek, lifted the child into his arms, and the 3 of them stood together framed in the soft dusk light, calm, whole, untouched. A fellow POW beside Hans inhaled sharply. "In Germany," he whispered, "families hide in cellars. Here, life goes on." The words were simple, but the truth inside them was not. In Germany, sirens tore the night apart. In Germany, the air tasted of dust and fire. In Germany, children were taught which neighbor had the strongest basement. In America, children played on porches at sunset. Hans felt a tightness in his chest. Not the old fear, not the unfamiliar kindness, but something more complicated. A widening understanding. A slow unmasking of a narrative he had believed without question. The war had already shown him the power of American machines. Today had shown him the power of something else. Miller's wife waved at the prisoners as the truck started moving again. An instinctive, harmless gesture, the kind people offer to strangers on country roads. None of them waved back. They were too stunned, too aware of what the moment meant. It wasn't the friendliness that overwhelmed them. It was the normalcy. Back at Camp Concordia, the evening routine unfolded with its usual precision. Dinner trays slid down the line. Meatloaf, boiled potatoes, cabbage, and glasses of milk cold enough to fog. POWs sat at long tables, talking low, stealing glances at Hans, who still seemed dazed. An interpreter passed through the hall announcing upcoming privileges. "Remember, tomorrow the canteen opens at noon. You may buy chocolate, razor blades, writing paper. Wages will be distributed after breakfast." Wages. Even the word felt obscene. The Americans paid them for their labor. Not market wages, pennies really, but enough for small comforts at the camp store. Hans remembered the posters in Germany. Americans depicted as tormentors, as childlike or savage, as a nation without discipline. And yet, here, discipline was everywhere, but it was discipline of fairness, not force. As he ate, his eyes drifted to the bulletin board near the exit. Pinned to it was the Geneva Convention summary, translated into German, with rules printed in clear, authoritative language. Prisoners must be treated with dignity. Food rations equivalent to those of American troops. Abuse punishable under U.S. military law. He had read it before, but tonight, after the Miller farm, it felt less like policy and more like something sacred, something the Americans believed not because they were told to, but because it was woven into them. Later, in the barracks, as lamps flickered and the wind settled into its lonely nighttime voice, the men usually passed around thin cigarettes or scraps of newspaper. Tonight, no one reached for distraction. They were thinking. One prisoner, a former teacher from Hamburg, spoke into the dimness. What if everything we were told was wrong? No one argued. Another man, older, with deep creases in his hands from years of carpentry, added quietly, "In Germany, I hid my daughter under the staircase during raids. Today, I watched an American farmer lift his granddaughter into his arms as if war didn't exist." A third man said, "Maybe strength is not what we thought." Hans sat on his bunk, elbows on his knees, fingers pressed to his forehead. He wasn't just recalling the pie, or the barn, or the water. He was replaying small things, the way Miller had spoken to them as equals, the lack of disgust in his eyes, the absence of hate. He never looked at me like an enemy, Hans realized. He looked at me like a man. Something loosened inside him, a knot he hadn't known he carried. He reached into the pocket of his camp shirt and pulled out the small notebook given to each prisoner at intake. He had used it sparingly. Lists, a few dates, a sketch of the ship that took him across the Atlantic. Now he opened to a clean page. He wrote slowly, carefully, as if shaping each letter were an act of confession. "We came expecting chains. We found neighbors." He stared at the sentence for a long time. Then he underlined neighbors. A guard walked past the barracks window, humming something, maybe a folk tune, maybe a hymn. Haynes listened to the sound fade. He had never heard a guard hum in Germany. Outside, the floodlights cast long beams across the yard. Beyond them, the night stretched into the endless Kansas dark. Somewhere not far away, a train horn echoed faintly, a reminder of a country still in motion, still producing, still alive. Hans thought of the American factories he'd glimpsed from the train, rows of aircraft noses protruding from hangars, tanks lined like stern metal giants waiting to roll east, mountains of crates ready for loading. This nation had outbuilt the world, outproduced every enemy, and it was still feeding its prisoners milk and potatoes. Power, he realized, wasn't just measured in steel. It was measured in confidence, in abundance, in a moral certainty that allowed a farmer to hand pie to the men who wore his son's enemy's uniform. This was not weakness, it was the opposite. The sergeant who supervised evening head count stepped into the doorway, checked names, then paused before Hans. "You feeling better?" he asked, not unkindly. Hans nodded. "Yes, thank you." The sergeant gave a short nod in return. "Good. Get some sleep. Big day tomorrow." When the man left, Otto, the youngest POW in the barracks, leaned closer. "Why are they like this?" he whispered. "Why treat us so well?" Hans didn't answer immediately. He looked at his notebook again, at the sentence he'd written. It wasn't enough. More needed to be said. He flipped the page and wrote another line. "America is strong because of what it builds, but stronger because of how it lives." He closed the notebook gently. In Germany, the war had consumed everything. Cities, fields, families, certainty. In America, the war had mobilized a nation without devouring its soul. Children still played. Families still shared supper. Farmers still baked pie. As sleep crept in, Hans realized something had settled inside him that would never leave. The day had not merely shown him kindness. It had revealed a moral truth he could neither ignore nor fully understand. America's greatest power wasn't its factories. It was its decency. And for the first time since leaving home, Hans felt something dangerously close to hope. Years later, long after the barn had been rebuilt and the war had ended, the memory of that day on the Kansas prairie did not fade. It lived in the private corners of minds, in letters written across oceans, in stories whispered at kitchen tables, It lived in the way German POWs, once enemies, once terrified, returned home carrying a truth that contradicted everything they had been taught. Hans Becker was among the thousands repatriated in early 1946. The transport ship bringing him back across the Atlantic was quieter than the one that had carried him to America. No one speculated about torture or starvation this time. No one feared the future in the same way. They stood at the railing, watching the gray horizon emerge, each man carrying an invisible weight of memories, some dark, some unexpectedly gentle. Germany, when they finally saw it, was a country of ruins. Stuttgart looked like a photograph torn in half. Whole blocks lay flattened, their outlines barely distinguishable from the muddy ground beneath them. Windows were broken, roofs caved in. Streets once filled with bicycles and market stalls were now mazes of debris. Children played among bricks because there were no toys, and old women swept rubble as if it were dust. Hans's mother's house was gone. He had known it might be, but the sight still struck him like a hammer to the chest. Neighbors he hadn't seen since before the war greeted him with tearful relief, and with questions. What were the Americans like? Did they beat you? Did they work you until you collapsed? Did you see their cruelty? Hans answered truthfully. They fed us, they clothed us, they treated us like men. The neighbors stared, unsure whether to believe him. He told them about the camp library, the milk served cold every morning, the wages in canteen coupons, the guards punished for cruelty, the Christmas concert played by American and German musicians together. But the story he told the most, always with a softness in his voice, was the story of the barn. He described the wind blowing through the Kansas grass. He described the farmer's smile. He described the pie. Some people shook their heads. Impossible, they said. Americans hate Germans. But in time, the stories spread. Other POWs returned with similar accounts, working on farms, being invited to Sunday dinners, receiving blankets knitted by local women. Men who had once been indoctrinated with fear now spoke of a nation that had treated them with dignity so disorienting it felt like grace. Over the next decade, many of those men remade their lives with those memories as quiet foundations. One became a school teacher, telling his students that democracy was not just a system, but a way of living with one's neighbors. Another became a carpenter, building homes with the same patience he had once used to rebuild a barn in Kansas. Several joined political groups advocating for a unified, peaceful Europe. A few, more than historians usually admit, returned to America and became citizens. They bought modest homes, worked in factories or on farms, married local women, raised children who grew up pledging allegiance to the flag their fathers had once fought against. And Hans? He rebuilt his mother's bakery from its ashes, brick by brick. The smell of warm bread once again drifted down the street, and every autumn, when apples ripened in the orchards outside town, he baked a pie. Not because he particularly liked sweets, but because it reminded him of something larger than himself. Something that had saved him in all the ways that mattered. He married, had 2 children, grew older. Yet the Kansas farm never left him. Sometimes at night he would stand in the bakery kitchen with the lights off, hands resting on the counter, and he would see the barn frame rising beneath his palms. He would hear Miller's voice. He would taste cinnamon and hear a young version of himself whisper, "Why treat us like this?" One summer evening in 1962, Hans packed a single suitcase, kissed his wife goodbye, and boarded a flight to America. He was 45 then, his hair beginning to gray at the temples. The world had changed. Germany was rebuilding. America was racing toward the moon. But some things Hans believed needed to be revisited. When he arrived in Kansas, he rented a small car and drove through miles of prairie that looked almost unchanged. The land was still vast, still golden, still breathing with a quiet certainty he had never felt anywhere else. He found the Miller farm near dusk. The barn stood straight and strong, rebuilt again after years of weather and time. A newer model tractor rested beside it, and a larger porch had been added to the farmhouse. But the heart of the place, the soul of it, felt the same. He knocked on the door. A middle-aged woman answered, surprised to see a stranger holding his hat in his hands. "I'm looking for John Miller," Hans said. She paused, then her expression softened with recognition. "I'm his daughter," she replied. "Dad passed a few years back. But are you one of the German boys who helped him build that barn?" Hans nodded slowly. Her eyes filled with tears. Not sorrow, but memory. "Come in," she said. She made him tea, showed him photographs, told him how her father always spoke of that day as one of the few reminders during the war that kindness still mattered. She led him to the porch, where the evening light turned the fields to amber, and he stood in silence for a long time, letting the wind wash over him. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "Please tell your family, thank you. Your father changed the course of my life." She placed a hand gently on his arm. "He used to say the same about you boys." Years passed, decades even. Hans's children grew up, then his grandchildren. They kept the bakery, expanded it, turned it into a small landmark known for its apple pie, a recipe passed down from a woman in Kansas whom Hans had never met, but had honored all his life. In time, the story spread beyond family circles. A grandson wrote about the barn on a small personal blog. A granddaughter mentioned it in an interview with a university newspaper. Someone shared an anecdote on a genealogy website. A stranger commented on a YouTube documentary. Another left a review on Amazon for a book about POW camps, saying, "My grandfather was a German POW in America. He survived because Americans treated him like a human being. Thank you." And so the story traveled, across screens, across generations, across continents. It became part of something larger, the quiet legacy of a nation that had not only won the war with bombs and factories, but with principles. America had been called many things: liberator, arsenal of democracy, superpower, but among former POWs, one title endured above all: the moral victor of World War II. Modern audiences reading these stories today often pause in disbelief. They compare the fractured politics of their own era with the unity of the 1940s, when neighbors shared ration books, when factories roared with purpose, when strangers helped one another simply because it was right. They wonder what changed, what was lost, and whether it can ever be regained. But every so often, a comment appears below a documentary or article. Simple, heartfelt, unmistakably real. I wish we could be that America again. And somewhere in Germany or Kansas, or a quiet corner of the internet, the descendants of men like Hans echo back, "We're grateful you once were." For kindness, when offered at the right moment, has a way of outliving the storm that made it necessary. Hans Becker grew old gently, the way men do when they have carried both suffering and mercy in equal measure. His hair turned silver, then white. His hands thickened with age. Still strong but softened by time, he became the kind of grandfather whose presence steadied a room, the quiet anchor of a family that had learned to read the unspoken between his pauses. He rarely spoke of the war when his children were young. Some memories were too sharp then, too unfinished, too heavy, but age has a way of sanding down the edges of pain until only the truth remains. And so it was his grandchildren, not his children, who first heard the real stories. One autumn afternoon, when leaves blew like embers outside the kitchen window, Hans sat at the table with his youngest granddaughter, Elise. She had her hair in braids, a pencil behind her ear, and a school assignment titled Family History Project in front of her. "Grandpa," she asked, "what's the kindest thing anyone ever did for you?" Hans looked out the window for a long moment. The sky was gray, the same shade he remembered from Kansas storms. Finally, he drew a slow breath. "It was October," he said softly. 1944, Ellis County, Kansas. And he began to tell her. He told her about the storm, about the barn, about the hammer placed in his hands, about the water offered without suspicion, and finally, his voice trembling, eyes shining, about the pie. Her eyebrows lifted. "A pie? Just a pie?" "No," Hans whispered. "It was never just a pie." His voice cracked slightly, the old memory unfolding like a treasured letter pulled from a drawer. He described the smell of cinnamon rising into the Kansas air, the warmth of the crust, the farmer's simple words. "Work is work. Men should eat." Elise listened, wide-eyed, leaning forward as though afraid to miss a single detail. "When I tasted that pie," Hans continued, "I remembered my mother's kitchen. I remembered who I was before the war, and I realized something that has stayed with me for the rest of my life." He rose slowly, joints stiff but determined, and crossed the room to a wooden box he kept on a high shelf. From it he took a notebook. Worn, yellowed at the edges, its cover softened by decades of being opened and closed with reverence. "This," he said, handing it to her, "is my journal from the camp." Her fingers traced the faded ink. When she opened it, she found a sentence written in steady, careful handwriting. "We came expecting chains. We found neighbors." She looked up at him. "Did you write that the day it happened?" Hans nodded. "And this," he said, pointing to the last page, "I wrote when the war ended." She flipped to the back where a final line stood alone. "America did not just win the war with steel, they won it with kindness." For a long time, neither spoke. The room felt full of memory, of love, of the fragile understanding that the smallest acts can reshape a life. Hans rested a hand on her shoulder. "Promise me something, Elise." She met his gaze. "Anything." "Don't forget that story. Not ever. Some wars are fought with weapons. Others, with how we choose to treat people." She nodded, and the promise settled between them like a blessing. Years later, after Hans passed away peacefully at the age of 86, Elise kept that promise. She was 22 when she traveled to America for the first time, carrying her grandfather's notebook in her backpack and a single slice of apple pie wrapped carefully in foil. She had planned her route meticulously, tracing highway numbers and farm roads until she found the one place her grandfather had spoken of more than any other. Ellis County, Kansas. The Miller farm had changed, of course. Time had added new barns, new fences, new generations, but the land felt familiar, even to someone who had never walked it, wide, honest, unpretentious. The wind still carried the scent of wheat. The sky still stretched endlessly, blue and open like a promise. She parked near the field where the old barn had once stood. A descendant of John Miller, a man in his 60s, met her by the gate, having read her letter weeks before and recognizing the look in her eyes. "You must be Hans's granddaughter," he said. She nodded, unable to speak. He pointed toward a patch of ground where the grass grew thicker. It was right about there. The barn your grandfather helped build. Elise walked slowly across the field until she reached the spot. She knelt, set the foil-wrapped slice of apple pie on the earth, and whispered, "Thank you for saving him." The man behind her rested his hands on the fence rail. "My grandfather always said it wasn't him who saved those boys. It was this country." Elise closed her eyes. She imagined Hans as a young man, thin, exhausted, frightened, standing where she now stood, staring at a half-collapsed barn and an American farmer carrying a warm pie. She imagined how it must have felt for him to find humanity in the middle of a war. She imagined the way his life had diverged from despair because of one simple act of decency. When she finally rose, the Kansas wind brushed her cheek as though acknowledging her presence, her promise, her lineage. That night, sitting in a small motel room, Elise opened Hans's notebook once more. She read the words on the last page again, slowly, letting them settle in the quiet space between memory and meaning. America did not just win the war with steel, they won it with kindness. She whispered the line aloud, as if returning it to the air of the country where it was born. And she understood, more deeply than ever, what her grandfather had tried to teach her. This was the America he had loved, the America that fed its enemies, the America that rebuilt barns with prisoners, the America that believed decency was a duty, not a luxury. An America strong not just because of industry or armies, but because of its heart. For the generations who watch this story now, the message lingers long after the narrative ends. This is the America our fathers and grandfathers built. This is why they were the greatest generation. And this is why we must keep the best of that history alive. In the darkest war humanity ever faced, America's greatest weapon wasn't its steel, its factories, or its armies. It was its humanity.